November 2018 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission, better known as Space Month, replete with space items, space staff, even, in my case, space socks. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the agenda for the day?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you. Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning.
For today's meeting, you will hear 10 items for your consideration. First, you will consider an order that addresses waivers of certain satellite licensing requirements for receive-only Earth stations operating with the Galileo radio navigation satellite service. Second, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking addressing comprehensive updates to the Commission's orbital debris rules for all Commission-authorized satellites. Third, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking addressing rules to facilitate the deployment of non-geostationary orbit-fixed satellite service Earth stations that transmit while in motion. Fourth, you will consider a memorandum, opinion, order, and authorization that would grant SpaceX requests to deploy and operate a proposed non-geostationary constellation to provide broadband services around the world. Fifth, you will consider an order and declaratory ruling that would grant Kepler's requests for U.S. market access to offer global connectivity for the Internet of Things using a proposed constellation of non-geostationary orbit satellites. Sixth, you will consider an order and declaratory ruling that would grant Telesat's request to access the U.S. market to provide broadband services using a proposed constellation of non-geostationary orbit satellites. Seventh, you will consider an order and declaratory ruling that would grant LeoSat's requests for U.S. market access to provide satellite broadband services in the United States using a proposed constellation of non-geostationary orbit satellites, including high-speed connectivity for enterprises. Eighth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking addressing additional streamlining of space and Earth station licensing rules. Ninth, you will consider a report and order that would modernize certain consumer notice provisions in Part 76 of the FCC's rules governing multi-channel video and cable television service. 10th, you will consider a report and order that would replace requirements for wireless service providers to report annually on their offerings of hearing aid compatible handsets with a requirement to provide enhanced information on their websites and to certify annually whether providers are in full compliance with the hearing aid compatibility rules. This is your agenda for today. Please note item 9 entitled Amendment of the Commission's Policies and Rules for Processing Applications in the Direct Broadcast Satellite Service, and as listed in the Sunshine Notice on November 8, 2018, has been adopted and released by the Commission and deleted from today's agenda. The first 8 items on your agenda will be presented by the International Bureau, and Thomas Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau, will introduce them.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for being here. Whenever you are ready, feel free to proceed. And for those in the staff, or in the audience, rather, as a public service announcement, if you need any Tang, a full pitcher will be next to Mr. Sullivan for the duration.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Space Month has been the result of significant work and coordination by dedicated staff throughout the Commission. And I'd like to take just a moment to recognize all of them before discussing the first item. This list, like the items being presented today, represent only a portion of the space and satellite work performed at the Commission. And I would therefore be remiss to not acknowledge the staff who are processing Earth station applications, reviewing equipment authorizations, coordinating frequencies with other administrations, reviewing experimental satellite applications, negotiating bilateral agreements, or representing the U.S. interests at ITU meetings. Julie Knapp and I would like to raise a glass of Tang and toast all of those at the agency who are working on these items. So thank all of them. Here. The International Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology are now pleased to launch the Commission's Space Month agenda by presenting this order that grants certain waivers of the Commission's Earth Station licensing rules in order to allow consumers and industry in the United States to access certain signals from the European radio navigation satellite system known as Galileo. This proposed action will augment the U.S. GPS system, thereby improving the availability, reliability, and resiliency of position, navigation, and timing services in the United States. I'm joined at the table by Troy Tanner, Deputy Chief of the International Bureau, Jose Albuquerque, Chief of the Satellite Division, Carl Kensinger, Deputy Chief of the Satellite Division, and Marissa Velez, Attorney Advisor in the Satellite Policy Branch. And from the Office of Engineering and Technology, Julie Knapp, Chief, Ron Rapazzi, Deputy Chief, and Paul Murray, Associate Chief. I would like to acknowledge the contributions on this item from other staff in the International Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology, as well as from our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Marissa will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This order would grant waivers of certain of the Commission's Earth Station licensing rules to permit non-federal Earth stations in the United States to operate with certain signals of the European Union's Galileo Global Navigation Satellite System. Like the U.S. Global Positioning System, or GPS, the Galileo system consists of a number of non-geostationary satellites that operate in the radio navigation satellite service. The European Commission has requested that the Commission waive certain of its rules to allow operations of the Galileo system with non-federal Earth stations. From a practical perspective, action on these requested waivers will permit a wide variety of devices in the United States to operate with signals from the Galileo satellite constellation and provide opportunities for improved positioning, navigation, and timing services across the country. As a threshold matter, the order recognizes that the Galileo system has a unique relationship with GPS. The United States and the European Union have worked together to ensure that the signals of the Galileo system are both interoperable and radio frequency compatible with GPS. This includes a 2004 US-EU agreement and subsequent cooperation. The order also details the significant public interest benefits associated with non-federal Earth stations operating with certain signals of the Galileo system. Positioning, navigation, and timing services are integral to numerous everyday industry and consumer applications, and reception of signals from the Galileo system can result in increased availability, reliability, and resiliency of these services. In specific terms, the order would grant waivers for operations with two of the Galileo signals. First, it would grant waivers for non-federal U.S. Earth station operations with the Galileo E1 signal, which is transmitted over the 1559 to 1591 megahertz frequency band. And second, it would grant waivers for non-federal Earth station operations with the Galileo E5 signal, which is transmitted over the 1164 to 1219 megahertz frequency band. These are the same frequency bands in which the U.S. GPS satellite signals operate. The order would deny the waivers requested for operations with the Galileo E6 signal. The E6 signal is transmitted over the 1260 to 1300 megahertz frequency band. And in that band, there is no corresponding allocation in the U.S. Table of Frequency Allocations for either non-federal or federal operations, or corresponding GPS signal. In addition, use of the E6 signal could constrain future spectrum management for non-federal operations in adjacent spectrum above 1300 megahertz. Recognizing the compelling public interest benefits in improving position, navigation, and timing services in the United States, as well as the established cooperation between the European Union and the United States regarding interoperability and radio frequency compatibility with GPS, the International Bureau and Office of Engineering and Technology recommend adoption of this order and request editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Velez, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I appreciate the chair. I'm going to assume my statement for the record. Thank you on this one.
Thank you. We'll turn to Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. A few months ago on a farm in Arizona, Frank told me about the first time he hopped on a tractor with his dad. It was long before anyone invented GPS or had heard of precision ag. In an open cab with dust swirling and heat beating down, Frank used to pick out a distant mountain and steer towards it, leaving a row of crops more rough than straight, he admits. He'd then swing around and steer towards another marker in the distance. It was tough work. 5 decades later, after his first ride along with his dad, Frank let me join him on a few passes in his new tractor. With the push of a button, it took off, able to drive itself and make precise inch-by-inch adjustments to everything from seed depth to type of fertilizer. All of that thanks to a constellation of GPS satellites more than 12,000 miles overhead. The GPS signals that travel from space to soil allow Frank's tractor to move in a laser straight line. Back in his cab, Frank said that precision ag has not only made his work a little bit easier, but it's also boosted productivity and cut down on costs for farmers across the country. And he's right. American farmers now feed the world. The U.S. exports more food than any other country. We produce more than the entire European Union. Our farmers do more with their land than anyone else because of their skill and because of technology. And that's why today's decision is so important. Galileo, the European satellite system that is similar to GPS, could give Frank and other farmers another big boost. The Galileo constellation will enable a broader range of services and applications, and since it's compatible with GPS, improve reliability and resiliency. And it's not just smart ag that will benefit. Everything from aviation to real-time directions on your smartphone could see improvements. And importantly, our decision will also advance public safety by allowing 911 dispatchers to get a better fix on your location. So I'm glad we're moving forward with today's decision. I want to thank the International Bureau and OET for their work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
All right, I want to go off script a little bit for a moment and acknowledge I have some additional assistance here today, courtesy of a late-breaking snow day at school. So I've got Caroline and Emmett, my children, joining me briefly this morning. I want to thank them for their patience, offer them some Tang, and also appreciate their ability to be quiet as we blather on up here. All right, back to our regularly scheduled programming. Location, location, location. If you ever want to buy a home or rent a place to live, you will hear that mantra over and over again. But the wireless era can also lay claim to being all about location. That's because we now depend on wireless location services for so much of modern life. And the evidence is all around us. We rely on global positioning systems, or GPS, to navigate our roadways, track our misplaced devices, and check in on social media. We count on GPS to support bank transactions, shipping systems, and the national power grid. Our military depends on it for everything from search and rescue missions to missile strikes. Simply put, GPS is a part of our national and economic security. That's why this decision the FCC is making today to augment our GPS system by giving the okay for consumers and businesses in the United States to use the European Global Navigation Satellite System, known as Galileo, is so important. As a result, location services in this country will be more available, more accurate, and more resilient. That means safer and more efficient transportation systems, improved emergency response capabilities, and more secure financial operations, not to mention improved critical infrastructure. That's good stuff, and it deserves this agency's support. But today's action also shines a light on an uncomfortable truth. While our rules require wireless devices in the United States to have a license, like the one we grant here, before operating with foreign satellites, the reality is more complicated. Go ahead, pull out your phone. Now look up the device specifications online. There's a very good chance that it already is capable of receiving not just the European signals we give the go-ahead for today, but also Russian and Chinese signals too. That's because our phones are built to be used anywhere in the world, not just in the United States. So they include chips that are designed to operate with global navigation satellite systems of other countries. If you read the record in this proceeding and others like it, it becomes clear that many devices in the United States are already operating with foreign signals. But nowhere in our record is there a good picture of how many devices in this country are interacting with these foreign satellite systems, what it means for compliance with our rules, and what it means for the security of our systems. We should change that. Technology has gotten ahead of our approval policies, and it's time for a true-up. Back to the here and now. I support today's decision because it complies with our existing policies. But on location matters, I believe we have more work to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. Parents relying on paper maps for driving directions. Pilots using bubble sextants to navigate flights. Farmers using distant mountains to direct tractors. Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Actually, it's the world before GPS. For eons, navigation meant primarily open your eyes, look up to the skies, and see. But thankfully, over the past several decades, we have made substantial technological advances. In particular, we have developed space-based positioning, navigation, and timing services known in the United States as GPS. In today's order, we are taking an important step toward making these services even better. Specifically, as Ms. Velez's presentation pointed out, we are granting the European Union's version of GPS called Galileo access to the US market. And we're ensuring that the signals of the Galileo system are interoperable and compatible with GPS. All of this means that Earth station receivers of non-federal government users will be permitted to use 2 Galileo signals in the same bands where GPS operates, increasing the availability, reliability, and resiliency of services. Or, in English, those with satellite-connected devices will have more pairs of eyes looking at them. Now, this breakthrough serves the public interest across many areas of our economy, including the automotive, aviation, rail, maritime, and agricultural industries. It will also produce public safety benefits by reducing the risks of accidents and disaster, aiding emergency response, and synchronizing power grids and critical infrastructure. And with our action today, we will hopefully make it easier for mariners, drivers, anyone on the go to find their way to a destination any way the wind blows. This order builds upon more than a decade of cooperation between the United States and the European Commission, and it would not have come about but for the team that Mr. Sullivan observed earlier in his presentation. And so I want to thank the staff of the International Bureau, the Office of Engineering Technology, the Office of General Counsel, the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for the heroic work over the past decade and change on this important item. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next International Bureau item on your agenda is entitled Mitigation of Orbital Debris in the New Space Age.
Terrific. Mr. Sullivan, the floor is once again yours.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, next, the International Bureau is pleased to present you with this notice of proposed rulemaking that recommends comprehensive updates to the Commission's orbital debris rules for all Commission-authorized satellites. We excuse from the table some of our colleagues from the Office of Engineering and Technology and thank them and the Office of General Counsel and Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for their contributions on this item. We proudly add to the table Jennifer Gilsonen, Assistant Chief in the International Bureau. Jennifer is our key satellite advisor and is amazingly overseeing all 9 of the Space Month items originally scheduled for this meeting. The Bureau, Commission, and the industry are extremely fortunate to benefit from Jennifer's expertise and professionalism. Space Month would not have been able to take off without her. For this item, I would like to specifically acknowledge and thank Carl Kensinger, our internationally recognized FCC expert on orbital debris, and our orbital debris protege, Marissa Velez, for all of their incredible work on this extremely important item. Marissa will present this item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, this notice of proposed rulemaking and order on reconsideration addresses the Commission's rules governing the mitigation of orbital debris. Orbital debris, also known as space debris, consists of a variety of objects, including non-functional satellites that are orbiting the Earth. This debris poses a risk to operations in Earth orbit, including satellite systems and manned spacecraft. In some instances, pieces of debris falling back to Earth can also pose a risk to persons and property on the surface of the Earth. Steps to limit the creation of new orbital debris or otherwise mitigate debris can help to address some of these risks and can play an important role in preserving access to space for the long term. The Commission's current rules provide for review of orbital debris mitigation plans for space station operations as part of licensing processes. This notice of proposed rulemaking represents the first comprehensive look at these rules since their adoption in 2004. The proposed changes are designed to improve and clarify these rules. Many of the proposals are based on experience gained by the Commission in satellite licensing processes since 2004, including addressing new developments in satellite technologies and system design. For example, during the past several years, the Commission has been reviewing applications for non-geostationary satellite systems consisting of very large numbers of satellites, and at the same time has seen an increase in the number of very small satellites, such as CubeSats, being launched into low Earth orbit. The Notice of Proposed Rulemaking seeks comment on proposals to address these and other developments and on the costs and benefits associated with various proposals. For example, the NPRM proposes incorporating numerical values into some existing disclosure rules to help provide clarity to applicants, as well as proposing new disclosures concerning the suitability of particular orbits given certain satellite designs and satellite disposal plans. The NPRM also seeks comment on issues related to reliability, including satellite disposal reliability, as well as a broader look at disposal methodologies and satellite on-orbit lifetime, with a particular focus on large non-geostationary satellite systems. Other aspects of the NPRM include proposals related to license extensions for geostationary satellites and sharing of location information. There is also discussion of proposed disclosure requirements related to new technologies and innovative activities, such as deployment devices and rendezvous and proximity operations. In addition, the NPRM considers economic incentives for improving debris mitigation. Finally, the order on reconsideration denies a petition filed by the Radio Amateur Satellite Corporation for reconsideration of the Commission's current orbital debris mitigation rules. Recognizing the important role of orbital debris mitigation in ensuring the continued safe use of space for years to come, the International Bureau recommends adoption of this notice of proposed rulemaking and order on reconsideration and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The fun part of talking about space and new technologies is considering the exciting new applications for service offerings, which we once again consider during today's meeting a little bit later. For those technologies to work, however, there needs to be a limited but sound framework to deal with accompanying policy issues. Orbital debris is certainly one of the components of such a framework. Failure to properly address the residual parts of launch vehicles and failed, damaged, or outdated satellites can lead to cataclysmic outcomes, making future space use and the possibility of space exploration more difficult, if not impossible. It's why we have conditioned each recent satellite application approval on compliance with further Commission action on orbital debris. Having spent considerable time studying the subject, I'm pleased that the Commission is finally taking steps to establish firmer expectations regarding orbital debris mitigation and hopefully elimination by satellite providers. In essence, this item isn't glitzy or glamorous, but represents the real work hours for our meeting today. To recognize the importance of addressing orbital debris, we need to understand the problem at hand. According to estimates from the European Space Agency, there are 29,000 objects larger than 10 centimeters and a whopping 750,000 objects between 1 centimeter and 10 centimeters in various orbits today. To provide a visual perspective on the scope of the existing orbital debris, I've borrowed, legally, a few pictures from NASA's Orbital Debris Program Office. You can see at the pictures. According to NASA, these are computer-generated images of the Earth in Earth orbit that are currently being tracked. Each dot represents the current location of each item and is scaled according to the size image of the graphic to optimize visibility. Any successful orbital debris policy will consist of many parts, including modeling, measuring and observation, mitigating, remediation, and planning for orbital re-entry. Importantly, the Commission is not the lead agency dealing with this issue, but with both domestic and international entities considering with far greater expertise and authority. Our primary role should be to ensure that current satellite providers are good stewards of their orbital and launch activities to prevent exacerbation of the problem. This important work becomes more difficult when applicants are contemplating satellite constellations with thousands of satellites and multiple launches. The item before us is a reasonable effort, and I thank the staff for their work. While I find some of the reporting proposals somewhat timid and the preventative ideas may be premature or uncooked, the notice is in sufficient shape to start the appropriate and necessary conversation on orbital debris. I appreciate my colleagues agreed to add information about possible technologies being developed to retrieve orbital debris. While these may be in the early stages, to the extent the Commission is asking about retrieval mechanisms, we should make sure that we have a more complete picture of what's in the works and whether these options and others are viable. Proposed solutions involve such devices as harpoons, sails, nets, and others. Consider that just over this last weekend, a launch occurred in New Zealand by Rocket Lab that is designed to minimize launch debris and includes an early version of a drag sail to capture and deorbit problematic space junk. In all, this is a good item on a vital issue. Accordingly, I will vote to approve. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. There are a few thousand communications satellites orbiting Earth. And at this point, most of them are no longer in operation. They've been downgraded to orbital debris. In the coming years, zombie and active satellites alike will have many more neighbors. One company alone plans to launch more than 10,000 satellites that will be smaller and fly closer together than previous generations. The new space race poses some tough questions, and they touch on everything from law to policy to engineering. Who should control space? What are the rules? And how do we ensure that satellites vital to communications, jobs, security are launched and disposed of safely? After all, the U.S. Joint Space Operations Center is already tracking over 500,000 pieces of orbital debris. This last question is the subject of today's notice. In 2004, the Commission issued its first order on orbital debris. Based on our general charge to promote nationwide communications, we determined that satellite licensees should provide an orbital debris mitigation plan. This 2004 approach was largely a disclosure regime that built on NASA standards. 5 years later, the importance of this issue was brought home when, for the first time, two communications satellites collided at hypervelocity, more than 26,000 miles per hour. A defunct Russian satellite collided with a then active one owned by an American company, producing over 2,000 pieces of debris. So given the increase in satellites over the coming years, today's notice proposes to replace our existing orbital debris regime with a more detailed set of rules. For instance, it asks whether the FCC should set the probability of large object collision during an orbital lifetime at no greater than 0.001. Adopt a satellite design and fabrication reliability standard of 0.999. Rely on gravitational forces and solar radiation pressure to lower a satellite's perigee as a preferred satellite disposal method, and set 15 joules as the correct kinetic energy of impact for objects that pose human casualty risk. All of this raises a more basic question. Are we the right expert agency to make these assessments? We can respond by saying, hey, we've got a lot of smart people here, and this isn't rocket science, except it is. It is literally rocket science we're engaging in. So I was glad to see that the draft circulated by Chairman Pai 3 weeks ago noted the expertise that exists elsewhere across the federal government. It recognized a number of our sister agencies that have expertise in jurisdiction over the launch and tracking of satellites, including NASA, DoD, the FAA, the State Department, and the new Office of Space Commerce. So building on that discussion, I asked my colleagues to expand the questions in the notice that go to our expertise and authority. And I want to thank them for accommodating my requests. The notice now takes an even bigger picture view. Some would say 30,000-foot view, but this is space, so that would be far too narrow. What are the right agencies and experts to answer these questions? Should the FCC be one of the lead agencies? Should we play a supporting and coordinating role? I'm glad we're now asking these questions, as well as inviting additional comment on our legal authority. So I want to thank the International Bureau and OET for its really hard work on this item. With the additional discussion, it has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Across the globe, we generate more than 2 billion tons of trash a year. But if you think our waste is limited to the ground, think again. That's because humans have been littering our celestial backyard with spent satellites, rocket fragments, and other discarded debris for as long as we've had the technological know-how. My favorite example is an innocuous little screwdriver that slipped through an astronaut's grasp and has been circling low Earth orbit at up to 21,600 miles per hour for the last 35 years. At these speeds, even a common household item can wreak havoc. That's 10 times faster than a bullet with the punch of a hand grenade. But this little screwdriver is not alone. Today, the United States Space Surveillance Network is tracking more than 23,000 objects larger than a baseball. The number of marble-sized objects has surpassed 500,000. And if you count objects the size of a grain of salt, there are easily more than 100 million pieces of debris circling the planet. Whoa. And this problem is about to get a whole lot more complicated. Whether it's the thousands of satellites being launched as part of their first-in-their-kind large constellations, the coming nanosat revolution, or an ill-defined space force, the likelihood of a debris disaster is higher than it has ever been in history. That's why, earlier this year, I called on the FCC to do more than just accelerate this problem by rubber stamping every next-generation satellite application that comes our way using yesterday's orbital debris rules. I called for us to think about the future. I called for a comprehensive review so that we can mitigate collision risks and ensure space sustainability going forward. I called for the agency to coordinate more closely with other federal actors to come up with clear national policies for this jumble of new space activity. I want to thank my colleagues for heeding this call, but today's rulemaking is, let's be honest, only a timid start. I am concerned it does not set this agency up for success in the future. It misses the forest for the trees. It asks loads of technical questions about what sorts of information about orbital debris we should expect from satellite operators, but it fails to set forth a vision for the coming commercial space age. Likewise, it proposes no principles or measurable goals for space safety. It also muddles the path forward. Go ahead and compare the draft that was released 3 weeks ago to the rulemaking we are voting on today. Instead of moving forward aggressively, as our draft effort contemplated, we backtrack and add confusing language about whether or not this work should even continue in these halls. This is not the leadership we need as we embark on a new era in space. We need clear guidance from this agency, and I think it should rest on 3 basic principles. First, everything that goes up in space should be trackable. We will never be able to protect against threats we cannot see. So we need to understand where all of our satellites are and where debris is with a high degree of precision. That includes working with our federal colleagues to improve methods to assess what is truly in orbit. Second, everything we put up in space should be drivable. That way our satellites can avoid existing orbital debris that might come their way or deorbit at the end of a mission. On a typical day, our military issues 21 warnings of potential space collisions. That number is going to rise dramatically, and drivability is key to preventing collision. Third, what goes up must come down. Some satellite operators have proposed large constellations of thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit that we all will be launched around the same time. And according to our colleagues at NASA, 99% of these satellites will need to be taken out of orbit as soon as they have completed their missions in space. And doing so will prevent collisions in the future. So I thank my colleagues for kicking off this proceeding. But it is not everything I hope it can be, so I concur. But I hope we can move forward expeditiously to develop a realistic debris plan that can be implemented soon. The new space age is not waiting, and we have work to do.
Thank you, Commissioner. The keen observers among you, including perhaps one Montague G. Taylor, are probably expecting me to start off this statement by discussing a certain movie set in space starring Sandra Bullock and George Clooney. I will not be so obvious. Instead, I would like to turn your attention to Return of the Jedi. At the end of the movie, as you know, after rogue pilots from the Rebel Alliance blow up the fully operational Death Star, Princess Leia, Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and company are celebrating on Endor with the awful, I would add parenthetically, Ewoks. But in the midst of this party, the film leaves a vital question unanswered. What will be done to address the threat posed by all of that space debris they just created? The Alliance apparently had no plan to mitigate it, and whatever rules the Empire had evaporated with the Empire itself. And this is a major omission. Space debris, after all, can be a very serious problem. In space, a very small piece of orbital debris can cause catastrophic damage. It's been over a decade since we last reviewed our orbital debris rules, and in that time, the number of satellites in use has increased dramatically. And so it's high time for the Commission to take up this important topic once again. And that is why last year we asked the staff to start looking at this issue. And today we are proposing new rules and disclosures to mitigate the threat posed by orbital debris. Indeed, we are exploring 6 ways to address this problem, including changes in satellite design, better disposal procedures, and active collision avoidance. I look forward to reviewing the public input that we get on these proposals and then doing our part to keep this final frontier safe for new and innovative uses. Thank you once again, as with the previous item, to the staff of the International Bureau, the Office of Engineering Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel for the work on this item. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Concur.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks for the great work. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third International Bureau item is entitled Facilitating the Communication of Earth Stations in Motion with Non-Geostationary Orbit Space Stations.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Whenever your folks are ready, Mr. Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the International Bureau would now like to present you with this notice of proposed rulemaking that seeks to facilitate the continued deployment of Earth Stations in Motion, or eSIMs, by expanding our current rules to cover communications with non-geostationary orbit satellites. In addition to those already at the table, we are joined by Stephen Dool, Chief of the Satellite Policy Branch, and Cindy Spears, an Attorney Advisor in that branch. Again, I would also like to acknowledge the contributions on this item from other staff in the International Bureau, as well as from our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, Office of Engineering and Technology, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Cindy will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
The notice of proposed rulemaking before you is another step in updating the rules that govern the licensing and operation of Earth Stations in Motion, or eSIMs. eSIMs is an umbrella term which includes Earth stations on vessels, vehicles, and aircraft operating as part of the Fixed Satellite Service, or FSS. This past September, the Commission adopted an order that significantly streamlined the rules that govern operations of eSIMs with satellites in geostationary orbit, or GSO. The item before you considers expanding the scope of our rules to cover communications between eSIMs and satellites in non-geostationary orbit, or NGSO. First, the proposed notice would seek comment on allowing eSIMs to communicate with NGSO satellites in many of the same conventional KU band, extended KU band, and KA band frequencies that are permitted for communications with GSO satellites, with the exception of the 18.6 to 18.8 gigahertz and 29.25 to 29.5 gigahertz frequency bands. Second, the proposed notice would seek comment on extending blanket Earth station licensing, which is available to eSIMs communicating with GSO satellites, to eSIMs communicating with NGSO FSS systems. Finally, the item seeks comment on revisions to specific provisions in our rules to implement these changes. These proposals are designed to promote innovative and flexible use of satellite technology, as well as to promote regulatory equity between GSO and NGSO FSS systems. Given the large number of applications for NGSO FSS systems that intend to provide service to Earth stations in the United States, it is important to consider rules for communications between these satellites and eSIMs. Such a regulatory framework would provide certainty for both NGSO satellite operators and their customers. The International Bureau recommends adoption of this notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits.
Thank you, Dr. Spears, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to submit my statement for this one as well.
Okay, Commissioner Carr.
Thank you to the bureaus for the work on the item. Really appreciate it. Has my support.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Speeding right along. I will also point out my children have now gone, so that was all they could take. A mark of intelligence or not having a long attention span, your choice. In any event, appreciate all the work that's been done on this, and look forward to the record that develops.
Not so lucky, folks. Willie Nelson famously couldn't wait to get on the road again, going places where he'd never been, seeing things that he may never see again. And that's true for millions of Americans today, with the twist that when they hit the road, they want to be connected. Connectivity is essential to communicating, navigating, and ensuring safety on the nation's roads and railways, airspace, and waterways. And as you may recall, eSIMs, or Earth Stations in Motion, often provide high-speed broadband connectivity on aircraft, ships, trains, and vehicles. For obvious reasons, users on the go are often the most difficult to serve with traditional wireline and wireless networks. And so earlier this fall, we streamlined our regulations for these licensees by combining separate regulations for different categories of eSIMs and expanding the satellite frequencies through which they can communicate with geosynchronous satellites. But geosynchronous satellites, of course, are not the only communications units in space. And as today's Space Month's agenda demonstrates, non-geosynchronous orbit satellites, or NGSOs, are increasingly becoming important in the marketplace, too. And today we propose to allow eSIMs to communicate with NGSOs in the conventional KU band, extended KU bands, and KA bands, frequencies that, in which eSIMs are already allowed to communicate with geostationary satellites. And our hope is that this proposal will allow eSIMs to make it easier for consumers to connect whenever they're on the go, using some of the cutting-edge satellite technologies that are available. Again, thanks to the staff for the terrific work on this item, and we will now proceed to a vote on it. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted, as requested. Thank you for the terrific work. Madam Secretary, to item 4 we go.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, items 4 through 7 on your agenda today will be presented jointly by the International Bureau. Item 4 is entitled Space Exploration Holdings LLC Application for Approval for Orbital Deployment and Operating Authority for the SpaceX V-band NGSO satellite system. Item 5 is entitled Kepler Communications, Inc. Petition for Declaratory Ruling to Grant Access to the U.S. Market for Kepler's NGSO FSS System. Item 6 is entitled Telesat Canada Petition for Declaratory Ruling to Grant Access to the U.S. Market for Telesat's V-band NGSO constellation. And item 7 is entitled LeoSat MA Inc. Petition for Declaratory Ruling concerning U.S. market access for the LeoSat K-band low Earth orbit satellite system.
Okay, thank you, Madam Secretary. Sorry about that. Mr. Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the International Bureau is now pleased to present you with 4 orders that facilitate the deployment of new, non-geostationary satellite orbit systems by SpaceX, Telesat Canada, Kepler Communications, and LeoSat. While each proposed system has unique characteristics, they will all help introduce new and innovative services to the United States and the global community. In addition to my esteemed colleagues from the earlier item, I am also joined at the table by Jay Whaley, an attorney advisor in the Satellite Policy Branch. Jay was the principal author on the SpaceX item. I would like to thank the other stellar staff in the Satellite Division that worked on these orders, including Joseph Hill on the SpaceX order, Chris Baer and Sylvia Lamb on the Telesat order, Cindy Spears and Sankar Prasad on the Kepler order, and Jennifer Ballatin and Sylvia Lamb on the LeoSat order. I would also like to acknowledge the contributions on this item from our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel, Office of Engineering and Technology, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. Jay will now present the items.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Over the last several years, interest has grown enormously in the commercial use of space to usher in a new era of services to people in America and around the globe. In particular, entrepreneurs and well-established satellite operators alike have set their sights on large constellations of satellites to provide next-generation communication services, taking advantage of technological changes that have greatly reduced the cost and size of the spacecraft used to provide these services. Beginning in 2016, the International Bureau initiated a series of new processing rounds to consider requests for the next generation of non-geostationary satellite orbit, or NGSO, satellite systems. The first processing round invited applications for NGSO systems proposing to use certain frequencies in the KU and KA bands. The second processing round invited applications for additional KA band frequencies, and the third processing round invited applications for NGSO satellite systems proposing to operate in certain segments of the V-band. In response, 19 applications were filed for constellations ranging from 2 satellites to over 7,000 satellites, proposing to offer a variety of services such as broadband communications, connectivity for the Internet of Things, and advanced imaging services. To date, the Commission has authorized 3 U.S. systems and granted market access for 4 NGSO systems. Today, the International Bureau presents for your consideration orders that recommend approving requests for another 4 proposed NGSO satellite systems. Collectively, these decisions will promote the development of new broadband services. Now I'd like to briefly describe each draft order. The first order addresses an application by Space Exploration Holdings, LLC, or SpaceX. SpaceX seeks authority to add V-band frequencies to its NGSO fixed satellite service constellation that the Commission authorized earlier this year. As part of its application, SpaceX also proposes a new very low Earth orbit NGSO constellation of over 7,000 additional satellites using V-band frequencies. The grant of this combined system, as conditioned, will provide SpaceX with additional flexibility to provide both diverse geographic coverage and the capacity to support a wide range of proposed broadband and communication services in the United States and globally. The second order is for Telesat Canada. Telesat seeks access to the U.S. market for 117 NGSO satellites licensed by Canada utilizing frequencies in the V-band. Telesat's proposed V-band system will serve as a second-generation overlay to Telesat's Ka-band NGSO system, for which Telesat received a grant of market access in 2017. Grant of this market access, as conditioned, will allow Telesat to include the United States in its plans to provide high-speed, low-latency broadband service to unserved and underserved areas around the world. The third order is for systems seeking FCC approval for the first time, Kepler Communications, Inc., which seeks to access the U.S. market for a proposed NGSO fixed satellite service system consisting of 140 satellites licensed by Canada. Kepler seeks to provide connectivity for the Internet of Things, especially sensors and other intelligent devices. The proposed grant, as conditioned, will allow Kepler to include the United States in its global network. Finally, the fourth order before you addresses a request from another entity seeking FCC approval for the first time, LeoSat MA Inc. LeoSat seeks access to the U.S. market for its proposed NGSO FSS satellite system. This system will consist of 78 high-throughput, low Earth orbit satellites licensed by the Netherlands. Grant of LeoSat's petition, as conditioned, will allow the provision of new and innovative satellite broadband services in the United States, including high-speed connectivity for enterprises and for underserved communities. Although all 4 proposals are technically and operationally unique, each decision before you takes into account the Commission's policies concerning orbital debris mitigation and spectrum efficiency. In most cases, the orbital debris mitigation plans for each proposed system's operations have not reached a final stage of development. Therefore, as a condition, further information must be submitted and approved by the Commission prior to the commencement of service under these proposed grants. The International Bureau recommends adoption of these orders and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
For the work you and others have done on these 4 applications. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These are exciting times in the development and deployment of new global satellite constellations that will serve consumers. Not since the early 1990s have satellite systems received such attention and captured the imagination of what new technologies, including high-speed broadband offerings, may bring. This also comes with some apprehension, as few can predict which satellite systems, if any, will succeed or make money, and the existing satellite offerings are indeed being subject to greater scrutiny. But this new race to satellite orbit provides a first-class seat to the dreams of visionaries, and I look forward to seeing what NGSO systems develop and what new services are eventually offered. Quite frankly, our job at the Commission is to approve the qualified applications and then let the market work its will. In these 4 items, the Commission approves 4 additional systems which will add at least an additional 7,859 satellites into orbit, if everything goes according to submitted plans. And this comes on top of the 9 applications and petitions the Commission has approved over the last 17 months. Between SpaceX's current application and the one previously consented to by the Commission, SpaceX alone is envisioning a future constellation of an unprecedented almost 12,000 satellites. As I said earlier today, new technologies, especially ones that revolutionize an industry model, oftentimes require the Commission to modernize and streamline our rules to provide a limited but sound framework to deal with accompanying policy issues. That is what today is all about. I support granting the SpaceX application and the Kepler, LeoSat, and Telesat petitions for market access. While there are still issues to be explored, including communications with eSIMs and orbital debris, and policy calls that we may not have gotten quite right, such as how we handle inline interference, the Commission continues to take necessary steps to allow investment and future deployment of these ambitious projects. I will approve. And I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. Never before have there been so many companies using such diverse technologies to connect Americans. And that is phenomenal news. We used to focus on improved speeds over copper, and then fiber, and then over the air using LTE. Today, the buzz includes fixed wireless and gigabit connections powered by high-band spectrum and 5G. With these 4 decisions today, we authorize another tool in the broadband toolbox: large constellations of satellites in low Earth orbit. These satellites are smaller and less expensive to launch than the traditional geostationary satellites that have been going up since the 1960s. They promise lower latency connections because they typically orbit only a few hundred miles above Earth as opposed to many thousands. Many corners of our country that don't have broadband today or don't have many broadband choices could soon see new high-speed services. At least 2 of the applicants we consider today plan to offer services that could enable IoT devices, powering smart cities and smart ag. And those use cases complement the many connections satellites make today on ships, airplanes, in homes, and on other vehicles. The broader point is that at this moment, innovation in tech and telecom has the extraordinary potential to benefit everyday Americans. As we move towards 5G, satellite, fiber, cable, fixed wireless, and a range of other offerings are all going to compete for your broadband dollars. And at the FCC, we can help move competition in that direction through smart policies. And that's what we're doing today. We're not picking winners and losers in the competition to provide more broadband to more Americans. We don't have the foresight to centrally plan the particular mode of connectivity everyone will use. Recognizing this is a good thing. After all, if your family is getting fast, affordable broadband, you probably don't care whether that connection is through a low Earth satellite or high-band spectrum. So that's the approach we take here. We let these 4 companies move forward and allow the market to decide their success. For my part, I'm excited to see what services these companies will offer. And I'm glad we're clearing the way for more choices and more connections for Americans regardless of where they live. So once again, I want to thank the International Bureau for its work on this item, on all the items today. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
The United Nations is well known for its Human Development Index. It's a lot like a national report card. It's a composite of indicators involving life expectancy, education, and per capita income. And as indices go, this is the one that gets all the glory at the General Assembly. But there's another United Nations index that deserves some time in the spotlight, and that's the Index of Objects Launched into Outer Space. Moreover, it's the one that directly informs our satellite work here at the Commission. According to this index, there are currently 4,857 satellites orbiting the globe. If you start counting from the fall of 1957, when Russia's Sputnik became Earth's first artificial star, a total of 8,126 objects have been launched into space. Now consider this. Today, this agency is approving more than 7,500 new satellites for orbit. That's on top of the more than 4,500 new satellites already authorized this year. Then, consider that we have another 1,200 proposed satellites still in our pipeline for review. Do the math. It adds up to a next-generation space race. New commercial models, players, and technologies are all coming together and rapidly multiplying the range of satellite services. With these new services come all kinds of opportunities. They include new capacities to connect more people in more places, use scarce resources more efficiently, support expanded access to education and healthcare, and grow economies beyond the limits of today's terrestrial networks. In other words, they could help with improving the very sorts of things that are measured by the United Nations in its Human Development Index. And this is exciting. Of course, increasing the number of satellites in orbit like this brings new challenges. That's because left unchecked, the growing amount of debris in orbit could make some regions of space unusable for years to come. This should concern us all, because junking up our far altitudes will constrain our ability to innovate, connect, and make progress with all satellite systems. That's why earlier this year I called for this agency to do something. We need a plan for managing orbital debris so that those who have launched and those who will launch can count on their satellites working for years to come. I believe we need to do more to address this challenge, which we only begin to address in a separate rulemaking today. But I'm grateful my colleagues agreed to my request that any new orbital debris policies adopted in this rulemaking will apply with equal force to the authorizations granted here. Thank you to the International Bureau and the Office of Engineering and Technology for your hard work on these applications and your continued efforts to ensure space viability and sustainability.
Thank you, Commissioner. Today we are considering applications involving 4 proposed NGSO constellations. Each of the applications differs in terms of the technical characteristics, business plans, and the like, but what they all have in common is the promise of variety in the burgeoning field of non-geostationary satellite services and innovative solutions to bridging the digital divide. From providing high-speed broadband services in remote areas to offering global connectivity to the Internet of Things through routers in space for data backhaul, I'm excited to see what these services might promise and what these proposed constellations have to offer. And our approach to these applications reflects this Commission's fundamental approach: encourage the private sector to invest and to innovate and allow market forces to deliver value to American consumers. I also would like to take a moment to recognize the staff of the International Bureau, not just for their efforts in bringing up to the Commission the items we're considering at this meeting, but for their ongoing efforts over these past 2 years. As Mr. Sullivan pointed out, since last June, the FCC has approved 13 market access requests and satellite applications to 9 companies for NGSO systems, including the 4 that we add to the list today. And this productivity is primarily due to your hard work and expertise. Thanks to your efforts, I'm optimistic that the American people will benefit from these new satellite-based services in the time to come. Thanks to the staff of the International Bureau, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and again, the Office of General Counsel for the work on these applications. We will vote sequentially on the 4 applications, beginning with item 4, SpaceX V-band NGSO order. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. On item 5, Kepler Corporation NGSO market access order. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Next, item 6, Telesat Canada V-band market access order. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. And finally, item number 7, LeoSat MA NGSO market access order. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Again, the chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks to the staff for the great work on these NGSO applications. And with that, Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 8 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 8, entitled Further Streamlining Part 25 Rules Governing Satellite Services, is our final International Bureau item today. And now our final introduction from Thomas Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. The end of the road is here, Mr. Sullivan. Bring us home.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, at the close of our time here at the table and the twilight of Space Month, it is my honor.
I see what he did there. Very nice.
It is my honor to express the gratitude of the women and men at the Commission who work on space and satellite-related issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Commissioners, for allowing us to highlight the important role these industries play in the United States and the global communications ecosystem. The International Bureau is now pleased to present you with our final item, a notice of proposed rulemaking that incorporates suggestions received from commenters during the Commission's biennial review of its Part 25 rules governing satellite services. This NPRM recommends streamlining the Commission's satellite rules, greatly simplifying the licensing process, and giving satellite operators additional flexibility in configuring their networks. Newly joining us at the table is Kerry Murray, a deputy chief in the Satellite Division, and Clay DeSalle, an attorney advisor in the Satellite Policy Branch. Clay will present the item.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning.
This notice of proposed rulemaking aims to streamline the Commission's satellite licensing rules by incorporating suggestions received in response to the Commission's biennial review process. First, the item proposes a new unified satellite network license. Today, the Commission has separate licensing processes for the Earth stations and space stations that make up a satellite network. These parallel licensing tracks, however, create duplication. The same or similar information is required in space station and Earth station applications, and the same or similar conditions are placed on Earth station licensees and space station licensees. The notice, therefore, proposes to combine these processes through the creation of a single, unified network license. Such a network license could significantly reduce the application burdens on Earth station operators in particular, to lead to faster deployment of satellite services to the public. Second, the notice proposes to align the build-out requirements for Earth stations and space stations in certain frequency bands. Currently, Earth stations must be constructed within 1 year of licensing. Satellites, however, have a 5-year build-out period. To meet the earlier Earth station deadline, satellite operators may need to construct their gateway Earth stations years before they are needed to ensure the sites remain available once the satellite is launched. To address this discrepancy, the notice proposes to extend the build-out requirements for Earth stations in certain frequency bands to coincide with the build-out requirements for their associated space stations. Finally, the notice proposes to repeal most satellite annual reporting requirements, to relax the notification requirements for minor Earth station changes, to update a decades-old out-of-band emission standard, and it seeks comment on whether to ease the acceptability standards for satellite and Earth station applications. To pursue these streamlining initiatives, the Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will submit my statement, but I do want to acknowledge and appreciate the work of the Bureau for working on the biennial review of telecommunications regulations, which hasn't gotten sufficient attention in the last many years. I think that's incredibly helpful, and I thank the Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner O'Reilly, Commissioner Carr, sorry.
Thanks. The Communications Act
Gray
instructs
hair,
us...
no hair.
Ouch.
That's fair, that's fair. The Communications Act instructs us to review all of our regulations every 2 years. And this house cleaning is an excellent practice that should be commended to all agencies. The streamlining here comes out of our last biennial review. And as we heard, it eliminates duplication in some of our licensing rules, aligns certain deadlines in a more logical way, and eliminates reporting requirements that have fallen out of use. Overall, we cut red tape and make it easier to connect Americans. So thank you again to the International Bureau for your work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenbristle.
No statement. This is good work. Thank you. I will vote to approve.
In 1958, the U.S. Army Signal Corps pursued a top-secret mission to develop the world's first communications satellite. It was launched into orbit aboard an Atlas rocket from Cape Canaveral on December 18th of that year, and the world learned of the project's success the next day. And that's when the satellite broadcast a recorded holiday message from President Eisenhower. And the message said, "Through the marvels of scientific advance, my voice is coming to you from a satellite circling in outer space." Well, 60 years after this milestone in the space race, satellites are critically important to delivering communications services to millions of Americans. And so today, we take steps to simplify the FCC's satellite licensing process and encourage the launch of new satellite systems. Most importantly, we propose to create an optional single license for space stations and Earth stations operating in a geostationary fixed satellite service satellite network. This proposal, which is the product, as Commissioner O'Reilly observed, of the FCC's 2016 biennial review of its regulations, would eliminate redundancies in the two separate licensing processes for satellites and Earth stations and ultimately result in the faster delivery of services to consumers. We also seek public input on streamlining and making more flexible our satellite rules and on reducing paperwork burdens on satellite operators by repealing unnecessary annual reporting requirements. Taken together, all of these changes are intended to ensure that the United States remains the most desirable country in the world for licensing, operating, and developing new satellite technologies. So thank you to the Commission's dedicated staff for the diligent work on this item. It has my support and appreciation. And with that, we will proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
And the chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thank you for the International Bureau for your work and your stamina this morning. Appreciate all of that. And with that, we'll go to item number 9, Madam Secretary.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, item 9, a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking entitled Electronic Delivery of MVPD Communications, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative will be presented by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
All right. Ms. Carey, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Media Bureau presents a report and order that allows cable operators to send certain required notices via email instead of on paper, as well as a further notice of proposed rulemaking seeking comment on the possibility of permitting other forms of electronic delivery. We believe these rule updates will give subscribers easier access to important information, will reduce paper waste, and reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens and costs. Joining me at the table are Martha Heller, Lyle Elder, and Kim Matthews of the Policy Division, and Kim will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking that continues the Commission's efforts to modernize its rules. The regulations at issue in this proceeding are set forth in Subpart T of Part 76 and require cable operators to communicate certain information to their subscribers in writing. These rules cover, among other things, information about channel deletions and service changes, contact information for local franchise authorities, charges for various services and service changes, and information about the basic service tier and broadcast signal availability. Last year, the Commission unanimously issued a declaratory ruling clarifying that the written annual notice requirements in Subpart T could be satisfied via email with certain consumer safeguards. The report and order before you would extend that flexibility to all general Subpart T notices to subscribers and to certain statutorily required privacy notices. All such notices could be delivered to a verified email address so long as the notice contains an opt-out phone number enabling customers to choose to receive paper notices instead. The item would also permit cable operators to respond to consumer requests or billing dispute complaints by email if the consumer used email to make the request or complaint or specifies a preference for an email response. The report and order would also eliminate sections 76-1621 and 76-1622. These rules require subscriber notices about outdated technology, such as special equipment that once enabled the use of VCRs and picture-in-picture features of televisions and related compatibility issues. Finally, the further notice of proposed rulemaking seeks comment on whether the Commission should permit the Subpart T and privacy notices to be delivered to subscribers via electronic means other than verified emails, such as through SMS texting. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt this report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privileges. Thank you.
Matthews for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman. As with previous items by this commission, today's item brings our media rules more in line with current consumer practices. Our efforts on this front are incredibly important and beneficial to both providers and consumers. In this simple item, we allow cable providers to notify subscribers of various statutorily required information obligations, including privacy practices and consumer data policies, via consumer-authorized email. Eliminating the obligation to provide paper notices will save time and money, reduce environmental waste destined for landfills, and improve consumer awareness. I also thank my fellow commissioners for agreeing to allow companies to provide website addresses instead of listing channel lineups and rates in annual notices if the consumer elects to receive them in paper. After all, such information is lengthy and burdensome to provide in print and is already available online. I also appreciate my colleagues' willingness to add a further notice of proposed rulemaking to explore whether and how best to allow other technologies, such as text, to be used to provide notifications to consumers. As I raised earlier in this proceeding, many consumers have moved past emails, especially given the high level of spam, and actually prefer different notification mechanisms for billing, customer care issues, and other purposes. We must recognize this and adopt and adapt, and I am pleased to see our work and will continue to modernize our rules even further. I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think it's now a matter of public record how our media modernization initiatives have impacted the weekends in the Carr household, so I will not repeat any of those stories today, thankfully, for everyone, and I will simply approve.
Wow, that's a total curveball. All right, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
If you, like me, are a subscriber to cable service, you know getting it set up takes time and effort. But after you do, you'll have loads of programming to watch and all sorts of content to call on. While you kick back and enjoy that service, you'll also get a lot of notices. Many of them are required by law. So sending these notifications via email can be convenient. It can cut down on lots of paper. If a cable company wants to email me information about signal quality complaint procedures, that's fine by me. If it wants to email about local franchise authority contact information, that's okay too. If it wants to electronically share a list of signals accessible without a converter box, I'm game. And if it offers some detail in email about equipment compatibility, all good. In fact, these things are not really going to impact my watching or my wallet. So sending them along to a verified email address makes sense. But if that same company wants to send me rate increases in email, it'd better first ask me for permission to do so. sliding new charges and new fees into my already crowded email inbox makes it likely that I miss any increase in cost. So before having my video provider raise rates via email, I think I deserve the right to choose to have it do so. However, that's not what my colleagues decide today. Instead, they determine that your cable company can make these choices for you. If they have your email on hand, they can simply stop sending you notices of billing increases in the mail, and instead let them pile up in your email inbox where you may not be looking for them, nor expect to find them, or where they may get stuck in your spam filter so that you never see them. This is not acceptable. The record in this proceeding includes not a single consumer. It features only filings from companies in the multi-channel video programming market. So this consumer has had enough. And on this aspect of today's decision, I dissent.
Today, we take a simple, common sense step that has broad support among commenters. We end the inefficient, environmentally unfriendly requirement for cable operators to send subscribers a panoply of legally required notices through the U.S. Postal Service, and instead to send those notices electronically to a verified email address. Now, that said, if consumers still prefer pulp, they can easily opt out of electronic delivery and still get paper notices. In addition, we'd like to learn whether cable operators and subscribers could take advantage of a broader range of electronic delivery options in the future. So we seek comment on additional avenues for receiving notices, such as texts and smartphone apps. I thank the staff for the work on this item, including Steve Brockert, Michelle Carey, Lyle Elder, Martha Heller, Tom Horan, Maria Malarkey, and others in the Media Bureau for the work on this item. Oh, sorry, Kim Matthews, how could I forget? Nancy Murphy, Holly Sauer, and Sarah Weitzel, and including as well Susan Aaron and David Consul from the Office of General Counsel. This is the latest media modernization item to get our approval, but it won't be the last, I suspect. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve in part, dissent in part.
The chair votes aye. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, can you please announce the last item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, your final item today will be presented by the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and Donald Stockdale, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction. The item is entitled Revisions to Reporting Requirements Governing Hearing Aid Compatible Mobile Handsets.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Stockdale, welcome to the bench, and the floor is yours.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present to you a rather down-to-earth ending to Space Month, a report and order that would reform the Commission's hearing aid compatibility reporting rules. I am joined at the table today by Garnet Hanley, Jonathan Lecter, and Suzanne Tétrault, all of the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. In addition to the staff at the table, I would like to thank the Commission staff listed on the slide for their input. Jonathan will present the item.
Thanks, Don. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. We present to you today a report and order which would modernize and streamline the Commission's wireless hearing aid compatibility reporting requirements. The Commission's current rules have been successful in making hearing aid compatible handsets widely available to consumers. In fact, all of the handsets now offered by the 4 largest wireless providers are hearing aid compatible. The report and order builds on this success and would take several key steps to update the Commission's hearing aid compatibility reporting rules to improve the information available to consumers and the Commission concerning hearing aid compatible wireless handsets. At the same time, these changes would reduce the burden on industry. Service providers would be required to post the critical data currently submitted on the annual hearing aid compatibility status report, the FCC Form 655, to their publicly available websites, enhancing the information already required by our rules. For example, service providers would be required to post information regarding the hearing aid and non-hearing aid compatible handsets currently and recently offered, including the handset's FCC ID and model name and number. At the same time, the report and order would eliminate service providers' obligation to file the FCC Form 655 and replace it with a streamlined annual certification. Service providers would certify to the Commission whether they are in compliance with the hearing aid compatible rules and if not, explain why. Service providers would also list their percentage of hearing aid compatible handsets across all air interfaces. Finally, the report and order would establish a reasonable transition period from the old reporting regime to allow service providers to adjust to the revised obligations without a gap in the period that the reports cover. Collectively, the measures in this report and order would enhance the availability of information concerning hearing aid compatible wireless handsets to consumers and ensure the Commission can continue to enforce its hearing aid compatibility requirements while streamlining unnecessary regulatory requirements that increase costs on all service providers. The Wireless Telecommunications Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges to make technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lecter, for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Men? Let me start by thanking the chairman for preparing this item, which reduces reporting burdens on the industry while ensuring the hearing loss community has the information they need to make informed decisions about handset purchases. The decision is in part possible because consumer groups, the wireless industry, and handset manufacturers came together to propose a reasonable and acceptable consensus-based solution to make additional hearing aid compatible handset information available online and allow the Commission to replace a burdensome reporting requirement with a simple certification. I thank participating entities for their efforts. I always found it far-fetched that consumers would get information about hearing aid compatibility by trying to locate and flip through separate reports filed at the FCC. Thankfully, we fixed that situation today. This effort, combined with the spreadsheet of manufacturer-compliant devices and the appropriate safe harbor from 2016, will truly empower consumers with actual helpful data. Accordingly, going forward, consumers will have a fulsome access to the information they need via provider websites, the spreadsheet with manufacturer information, and the Global Accessibility Reporting Initiative. I appreciate that my colleagues agreed to broaden the scope of those persons eligible to sign the certification to also include knowledgeable executives as opposed to only officers. However, I propose to change the language of the certification to substitute the personal knowledge attestation with a certification that procedures are in place to ensure the provider is complying with the Commission's hearing aid compatibility rules. While the words personal knowledge have been removed, an executive still must certify that the provider was or was not in full compliance with the rules. First, I can't imagine why an executive would agree to sign anything where he or she would have to certify that every rule is being followed. An executive does not have the ability, for instance, to determine whether each and every store employee is selling handsets is complying with our rules. Second, while the joint consensus letter is not as clear as some would like, this decision completely ignores the language that the certification here should be similar to the annual certification put in place to ensure compliance with CVAA. So a word to the wise. Do not put in flowery language into an agreement that you think will curry favor with some. Cross every T and dot every I because clear intent is not sufficient. Even if you think you struck a deal, it does not have to be upheld or honored. Third, changing the language in the certification would not have watered down the Commission's or the wireless provider's commitment to ensuring the effectiveness of hearing aid compatible devices. Wireless providers still have to comply with all of our hearing aid compatibility rules. Unfortunately, we have a certification that looks to be rather unworkable, that entities may refuse to sign, and may have to be reconsidered down the road. I will, however, approve today's item because it does a lot of good otherwise, including eliminating some reporting requirements, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks. I'm glad that carriers and manufacturers alike are taking steps to ensure that all Americans can benefit from next-gen technologies. For instance, as the decision today notes, 100% of handsets sold by the 4 largest wireless carriers are now HAC compliant. This is up from just 1/3 to 2/3 of phones only a few years ago. And on the manufacturer side, 93% of devices are now HAC compliant, compared to nearly half that figure in 2010. All of this supports today's decision, which updates and modernizes our approach to ensuring that everyone has the right information about hearing aid compatible phones. I'd like to commend the consumer groups, carriers, and manufacturers who worked together on the consensus proposal. This decision strikes the right balance and ensures the availability of information consumers need to make informed decisions. I'd also like to acknowledge Commissioner O'Reilly, who has long pushed for greater clarity and reform in this area. Thank you to the staff of the Wireless Bureau for your work on the item. It has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
The National Institute of Health reports that over 37 million adults have some trouble hearing, and close to 30 million Americans could benefit from the use of hearing aids. Those are your friends, your neighbors, and your relatives. An increasing number of them are veterans. In fact, hearing problems are the most common service-connected difficulty experienced by those who have served and military personnel who are repeatedly exposed to gunfire and explosives face special risk. So it was good news 2 years ago when this agency set out on a path to make sure all covered handsets offered by carriers will be hearing aid compatible in the not-too-distant future. In the meantime, we are taking steps to ensure our paperwork keeps up. To this end, we eliminate the use of a dated form by which wireless providers demonstrate that their devices comply with our hearing aid compatibility rules. Instead, we require that more information be available to consumers online in a more accessible manner. At the same time, we require carriers to certify compliance with our hearing aid compatibility requirements. This approach is modern and it has my support. I'd like to thank my colleagues for working with me to make sure that the information available online features a date and includes a link to this agency's hearing aid compatibility resources. This will help those with difficulty hearing access information more easily about how to seek devices that meet their needs. Thank you to the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and also the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, especially the Disabilities Rights Office, for your work to make this happen.
Thank you, Commissioner. In 2003, the FCC adopted rules to require wireless service providers to make more handsets available that were compatible with hearing aids. Those regulations achieved their objective, and now far more hearing aid compatible devices are sold than was the case back then. Today, in light of changes in the marketplace, we are modernizing our hearing aid compatibility rules. Specifically, we're improving our hearing aid compatibility reporting requirements to ensure that information is available to consumers in the places they most often go looking for it. We revise our rules to require service providers to post on their website the most critical information currently submitted on FCC Form 655, which is an annual report that providers have been required to file with the Commission. This step is broadly supported by the hearing loss community, by nationwide, rural, and regional wireless service providers, and by handset manufacturers. This revision to our website disclosure rule will enable consumers to obtain the relevant information they need about the availability of hearing aid compatible devices. It will also allow us, the FCC, to ensure compliance with a minimal burden. Given this new disclosure requirement, we are relieving providers of their annual reporting requirement and replacing it with an annual certification of compliance with the FCC's hearing aid compatibility rules. Because current reporting requirements will remain in place for device manufacturers, we believe that the rules we adopt today will make it easier for consumers to find the information they need while simultaneously relieving small companies from filling out unnecessary paperwork. Many thanks to the hard work of our dedicated staff that worked on this item. Garnet Hanley, Eli Johnson, Jonathan Lecter, Michael Rowan, Becky Schwartz, Dana Schaefer, Suzanne Tatro, and Weiren Wang from the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Susan Barr, Elliot Greenwald, Susie Rose Singleton, and Karen Peltz-Strauss of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, Pamela Hairston of the Enforcement Bureau, Shanna Wilkinson of the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and Bill Richardson and Anjali Singh from the Office of General Counsel. We'll now proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
The chair votes aye as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time?
I just want to point out that the tang lasted, or perhaps outlasted the meeting, and there's probably a metaphor in that.
I think, I mean, this Tang was developed in 1958. We have the exact same picture here from NASA. So it's been sitting there for decades. So.
What an honor.
Yes, exactly. Well, if nobody else has any announcements, I have a couple of announcements I would like to make. Unfortunately, our interns for the semester are leaving. One of them isn't here, so I won't announce him yet, but one is, Lauren Houston. If you don't mind standing, I'm afraid this is the requisite harassment we offer our departing interns. Lauren was fantastic this semester, did terrific work on a number of different items. She helped draft one of the more technically complex items on operational expenses for universal service support, did a terrific job, and was just a great presence to have around the office, not least because this week, being a politically savvy operator, she brought in brownies gratis for the entire office, which won a brownie competition. Thank you, Lauren, for the hard work and for the delectable contributions you also made to our office. It was fantastic having you here, and we wish you well in the future. One other departure that I wanted to note, our security team here has just been fantastic. Those of you who have gotten to know them know that they are the salt of the earth. Unfortunately, one of them recently left, Mika Lewis, just a terrific, warm person. I know her best because she would often keep a stash of chocolate near her desk that I would pilfer, and in exchange, she would often pilfer some of my Reese's. That is no longer happening, but we certainly wish her well, Mika. It was great to have you here. Thank you for helping keep this agency safe, and we wish you all the best in the time to come. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Wednesday, December 12th, 2018.
With that, we stand adjourned.
Didn't make the point, but I do appreciate the reference to pilfering by a security official.
If you could please take your conversations outside, that would be much appreciated. We are getting ready to get started with the open meeting press conference. Just again, I wanted to remind everybody to please take your conversations outside or be seated. We're ready for the open meeting, post-open meeting press conference. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Chairman Pai.
Thank you, Tina. I can't help but note that Monty has absconded. I guess he really was ashamed of his failure to catch the Queen reference. That's unfortunate. As you might expect, I was greatly tempted to pepper these remarks with a bunch of knowing references, for example, about how the Commission's Space Month agenda was the right stuff, or for the U.S. space industry, but I'm going to do my best to resist that temptation, not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And because Space Month is seriously a big deal. We talk a lot about the importance of the global race for 5G leadership, and it is very important. But not enough of people appreciate that the space industry represents another multi-billion-dollar growth opportunity that the United States is poised to lead. Here are a few key facts. The global space industry is roughly a $350 billion a year business. In separate reports, both Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs have projected that it will grow to be a $1 trillion sector by 2040. And in these same reports, expert analysts identify satellite-delivered internet access as the biggest growth opportunity. Just last week, I attended a forum with NASA's Associate Administrator and Acting Chief of Staff, Tom Kremens. And Tom spoke eloquently about NASA's commitment to promoting emerging commercial systems in space. And I'm pleased to say that the FCC shares this commitment. Of course, it's better to show than to tell, and that's exactly what the FCC did today, by approving 4 separate petitions from companies seeking to initiate or expand services that rely on non-geostationary satellite orbit constellation systems. Unserved or underserved areas, especially rural, remote, and tribal areas, may soon enjoy new options for high-speed connectivity that they've never known before. By allowing American devices to access the European Global Navigation Satellite System called Galileo, GPS should become more precise, more reliable, and more resilient for American consumers and businesses. By updating our rules for Earth stations in motion, we can make it easier for consumers who need a broadband connection when they're on the go, on a plane, on a train, or in an automobile, to access the technology that helps meet their needs. By launching the first review of the FCC's orbital debris rules since 2004, we seek to mitigate the risks of catastrophic accidents as we transition from the era of a couple thousand active communications satellites in orbit to many thousands. and by streamlining rules and licensing operators for satellite companies. Satellite licensing options, I should say, for satellite companies. We ease the path for the rollout of new services. Collectively, I hope that these seemingly small steps by the Commission will amount to a giant leap for the U.S. space industry. And on that punny note, I would open the floor to any questions you might have.
Hi, Mr. Chairman, Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. A question about terrestrial networks. There have been outages, of course, with cellular networks after hurricanes and wildfires. How big a problem is that, and what should be done to resolve these outages more quickly?
That's part of the reason why we looked at updating our wireless resiliency framework. That is part of the reason why, in the context of our Universal Service Fund programs, I've been very aggressive in trying to address them, to tailor them to meet the needs of some of those areas that are affected with these outages. That's part of the reason why consistently after any disaster happens, whether it is a hurricane or a fire or other type of emergency, I'm consistently getting updates from the Public Safety Bureau staff. I'm consistently on the phone with people trying to get updates from the field. I'm consistently talking with some of our federal partners at FEMA and other places. And I'm consistently looking for opportunities to get out to those places to see for myself how these outages are affecting residents. And that's part of the overall strategy we have to make sure that our networks, which are a critical part of the emergency response and recovery framework, are as robust as they possibly can be.
Earlier, you expressed dissatisfaction with the pace of recovery, for instance, in Florida. Will you consider imposing requirements on telephone companies to do better, equipment requirements, some kind of requirements from the FCC?
I think one of the things I'm very heartened about coming out of the Hurricane Michael situation in Florida is that there's better coordination now between some of the telephone companies and some of the power companies. And part of the challenge there that we heard about was that you might get the fiber up and running that is necessary for wireless backhaul, but if there's another crew working alongside concurrently with that company that's just looking to get the power line back up, they might inadvertently snip that fiber. And so I think better coordination is the key to solving that problem. And again, the wireless resiliency framework writ large is something that we are looking at to try to mitigate the effect of outages when they happen and to encourage the recovery of those systems should an emergency strike.
David, go ahead.
Hi, Dave Cal, Communications Daily. I'll defer to my spaceman colleague, Matt Danneman, on the space questions.
Wow.
But can you give us some sense, obviously you were very supportive of DOJ's complaint against the net neutrality law in California that led to it being held in abeyance for now. Can you give, there's a bunch of other state laws out there. There's one in Washington that's a net neutrality law, and then there's a bunch of procurement laws and executive orders. So far, DOJ hasn't done that, and that's obviously their discretion whether they're going to go after that. But what are your views on the other state laws and orders, including the procurement decisions, in terms
As
of
I've said in the past, it depends on the particular law in question, and to the extent that, as was in the case of California, the state tries to essentially supplant the federal regulatory framework with a system of onerous regulation that is even stricter than the 2015 regulations that were put in place by the previous commission. The agency will look to vindicate the basic interest, which is that interstate activity, which the internet is, can be only regulated by the federal government, and that any contrary state regulation of that type of activity is preempted.
Hi, Kelsey Griffiths with Law 360. I was wondering if the Commission is planning to make any announcements about unauthorized satellite launches, particularly swarms that was reported earlier this year. If I'm not mistaken, I don't think the Commission has said anything publicly about this yet. Is that something that you're still working on?
It is something we're still working on. Unfortunately, I can't give you a particular time frame or discuss the merits of the issue at this time.
Okay.
Margaret McGill with Politico. So given the change in Congress following the elections and the promise of additional oversight from House Democrats, do you intend to serve out your term as chairman?
I fully plan and expect to serve as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission for the next 2 years.
John Reed, Bloomberg Law. A recent study by researchers at Northeastern University and University of Massachusetts found that some telecom companies are throttling data on apps like Netflix and Facebook. Do you think the FTC should look into these reports, and what actions should the FTC consider against companies that are found to have throttled data?
My understanding is that the data and analysis that went into those conclusions have not been made available to the extent that others independently can verify those results. But in any case, any allegation or issue along those lines can be addressed to the Federal Trade Commission, and this is precisely why we established a framework both of transparency here at the FCC, so that any company has to disclose various business and network management practices, backed up by Federal Trade Commission enforcement. And so to the extent that someone wants to invoke the FTC's unfair or deceptive trade practice authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act, the MOU between our two agencies and the chairman of the FTC's stated commitment to investigating these allegations, I think would protect consumers and competition.
Hi, Chairman. Casey Egan, S&P Global Market Intelligence. I want to ask you about the Commission's small cell infrastructure order that passed in September. Now that operators and municipalities have filed suit in response, I'm just wondering what response you would offer to those who are concerned that the litigation that followed the order might slow down 5G deployment.
I think, first of all, we made the right decision in the order, and especially having just come from an international conference where everybody is looking to the United States as one of the leaders in 5G. We do not want the multiple layers of regulatory review of small cell deployments and other critical 5G infrastructure to be slowed down by municipalities, states, anyone else who is looking to, who are looking to essentially exert their authority and slow down deployment for the benefit of their constituents. And so going forward, our goal is pretty simple. We want there to be a consistent, clear regulatory framework for the deployment of 5G infrastructure. It won't happen if the U.S. doesn't take aggressive action on this front. And number two, in terms of litigation, I would defer to our general counsel and the many able lawyers out there to figure out its fate. But I'll simply say that we believe, based on the law and the facts, that we made the right decision.
Hi, good afternoon. My name's Toby from Policy Tracker. Hi. It's about the presidential memorandum on the national spectrum strategy. Do you think it goes far enough in terms of clearing federal spectrum for exclusive use, for commercial space use or mobile use? Because at the moment, I believe it doesn't actually talk about identifying a target of exclusive spectrum. Thank you.
I think you've put your finger on one of the key points in terms of spectrum policy, is that we need to have a better understanding of federal spectrum holdings and have a strategy for addressing some of the federal spectrum that can either be shared or relinquished. And along those lines, I was heartened to see that Senators Lee and Markey yesterday introduced legislation addressing this topic. I haven't had a chance to study it in detail, but certainly in terms, conceptually speaking, I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of trying to assess what the holdings are and what the opportunity cost is. In terms of the directive, we're always working with our federal partners to identify different federal spectrum bands that can be, as I said, either shared or relinquished. And I think this is an area where we can establish win-wins for both federal users and non-federal users. And I look forward to cooperating with all federal agencies and the private sector to make that happen.
So you don't think it should have gone further then in the actual memorandum?
I think the memorandum made some important steps forward in terms of asserting U.S. leadership in 5G and enabling us to take the tools we have in the toolbox, all federal agencies, and use them to deliver leadership going forward.
Mr. Chairman, the American Cable Association raised antitrust complaints about Comcast, complaints that the president seemingly sort of echoed on Twitter. Not asking about the merits of that complaint of you, I'm just wondering, do you think the existing program access rules are sufficient to address those, or do they need to be addressed by the agency?
My understanding, not having reviewed the complaint or any documentation supporting it, is that it was a complaint addressed to the Department of Justice, and so I can't really comment on any aspect of it.
Well, like I said, I'm not asking about that complaint itself. I'm just wondering if you think that the program access rules as they stand right now for the FCC are robust enough to address similar-like kind of complaints.
Again, it would depend on the nature of the complaint, so I can't opine in the abstract about what a particular complaint might portend for the sufficiency or insufficiency of those rules. Sorry.
Just a two-part question. First, Mr. Chairman, is there any update on when you might act on concerns about China and other infrastructure issues?
The supply chain proceeding? No particular time frame I can offer today.
And talking about the satellite approvals today, can you talk about in the near to medium term, how much do you really think these satellite-based services are going to provide internet access, especially in rural areas? I mean, is it going to be a significant chunk, do you think?
It's hard to forecast with precision, but based on the people I've met with, many technologists and entrepreneurs and innovators are working hard to make some of these systems a reality. And I think one of the very interesting things, if you look at just the 4 NGSO applications we adopted today, they're targeting different business plans, which I think are quite interesting, whether it's an Internet of Things, a business plan, or serving rural enterprises. I mean, I think there are a variety of different companies taking different bites at the apple, so to speak. And my hope is that all of them will have a full and fair chance to compete. We certainly don't want the FCC to stand as a bottleneck for them to have to innovate around. Instead, we want to set a framework that allows all of them to innovate. And that's precisely what we've done. And I can tell you, whenever I'm on the road in some of these small towns, tribal areas, remote areas, this is the #1 concern that people have, is we don't have internet access at all, or there's insufficient competition. And to be able to beam internet access from space at a price point, at a speed, and with the latency that's comparable to a terrestrial provider, that could be a game changer for millions of rural Americans who find themselves on the wrong side of the digital divide. And so we want to encourage all companies to innovate along these lines.
How about Todd's question? So do you think that could basically fill a gap, so if you have a natural disaster, you're not going to have lines cut overhead?
Absolutely. That's one of the things we're hopeful for. And I just spoke to some satellite providers about this when I was at the Hudson Institute last week, is that, and they were telling me too, that in the wake of emergencies like a hurricane, when the terrestrial infrastructure is wiped out, if you can quickly get Earth stations in place and get internet access delivered through satellites, that could quite literally be a lifeline for people who otherwise might not have any access to the outside world.
Mr. O'Reilly, I'm just kidding.
Won't be opining about the Buffalo Bills today, so it's a disgusted though I am that they destroyed my Jets defense last weekend and forced me to lose to our chief of staff, who's been gloating all week. So anyway, have a good Thanksgiving, everybody.
All right, thank you. And at this point, we'll transition to the Bureau press conference with my colleague, Mark Wickfield.
Thanks, Tina. So I think we'll do all the international items in one fell swoop. Are there questions on the international items? Yes. So why don't you come up? I'm not sure which items we'll be talking about, but
Get the whole team here.
all right, Tom.
Yep.
Big team. Oh, and OET. Sorry, Julie.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. We'll look here. Go ahead, Kelsey.
Law 360. I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit more about the coordination process involved in the 4 applications that were approved today. Obviously, the FCC offered its approval, but did you have to coordinate with any international partners or any other government agencies to do so?
So yes, thank you for the question, Kelsey. We do coordinate these through NTIA, through the IRAC process there, and they would send that out for further comments to the federal agencies to see if they had any particular comments or questions or concerns.
And that already happened, or it's about to happen?
That has already
Okay,
happened.
got
yes.
it.
Yep.
Matt Danny, Communications.
Matt.
2 questions about 2 separate IB
Okay,
items.
that's fine.
Talking about international coordination, talking on the debris side.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's a space policy directive that the president put out about debris issues, where they're supposed to work with other agencies. Other nations are working on debris issues as well. How is the FCC coordinating both with other federal agencies on debris questions and also with other federal agency or other nations' agencies on debris issues? What's that feedback loop look like both in DC and internationally?
Sure. So I'm going to address it, and I might turn it over to one of our debris experts to back me up on some of the international timeframes. But with respect to the President's space policy directives, the Space Policy Directive number 3 is the one that would particularly deal with the orbital debris issues that we're dealing with here. They're separate. They're not tied. They're not related. What we're doing from the FCC perspective is on our own regulatory authority. But I do see them as complementary in process. On the federal side, the executive branch has control of the DoD satellites, the NASA satellites, the NOAA satellites, and they can set the debris mitigation and orbital debris plans for them. We work closely with them, and we are actually working as part of the SPD3 process as a consultant, as a consultative body. My FCC staff participates in those calls, and we provide the expertise and guidance that we have from a national domestic regulatory perspective to that process, and we also get to hear what they're thinking. So it's a very well synced process that's going on right now on the domestic side of how we're trying to deal with this in totality. On the international side, you bring up a great point. There are a lot of nations that are trying to become spacefaring nations, maybe not with the degree of expertise. There are some international bodies that deal with these issues that both the U.S. government participates with and in, and also we have staff from the FCC that participate on these delegations that are run by the State Department. One group is IADC. Where's Carl? Yes. IADC, and Carl can talk a little bit about that group if you would like. And the other group that we participate with is UN COPUOS, and they both deal with these types of issues. We've received very laudable notes from State Department for our participation in these activities with other international administrations. They can recognize that there is a role for those who are regulating the commercial satellite industry with the frequency communication aspect, for them to actually play a role to help safeguard the space environment. Carl, do you want to talk a little bit more about IADC? Or
just mention what it is.
Sure, yeah.
So the IADC is the Interagency Space Debris Coordination Committee, and it is a NASA-led effort from the U.S. perspective. And we do participate in the delegation that goes to one of the working groups there. That group is a group of space agencies, and there are a number of areas that they look. Some of them are in basic research, which obviously not something that we do at the FCC. We rely on that work as a sort of an input to some of the work that's also done on mitigation standards and guidelines. And so that's one of the areas where that sort of work is done internationally. And then we also, Tom mentioned the COPUOS, particularly the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, and we coordinate. That's a State Department-led activity, and we do coordinate with the State Department activity and U.S. inputs to that body.
Anything further for this team? Yeah,
Go
ahead, Tim.
Well, I mean, it's on the same point, really. So if I'm operating a satellite constellation and I obtained a license for that from, say, another country, China or India or something, nothing in this space debris item today would mean I have to improve my standards or something to make sure that the chance of it becoming debris is less or something like that.
Well, so the current rules we have, and this wouldn't change, do require that for a system that's accessing the United States market, that system has to meet essentially the same standards as a U.S. licensed system. So we do have that as an incentive for if someone wants to operate a global system. Obviously, that's it's an incentive to follow the same requirements that U.S. licensees are following. And I do think, you also see similar approaches in some other jurisdictions as well.
And to follow up, that's exactly why in the 4 NGSO orders that were granted today, those with market access still had to comply with the U.S. requirements on orbital debris issues. And so we very much are making that point. Any system, U.S. or not, that wants to serve the U.S. market with the communication satellites needs to follow our orbital debris rules. And it's not just the commercial, it's also experimental and the amateur services.
Dave? Yeah, on the Part 25 streamlining thing, can you just tell us, were there any substantive changes made to the NPRM, the draft NPRM?
No, there were no substantive changes on the Part 25 streamlining.
Matt, did you have one more?
Yeah, on the 4 NGSOs, with the KU-KA band approvals, they've followed a somewhat of a pattern of every few months, a small block of 1 or 2, that sort of thing. Does the agency anticipate deviating from that pattern at all with V-band? As now you're starting to get into the V-band approvals, will it follow the same kind of rough melody?
Well, first of all, I think we've done an excellent job, and I can't applaud the staff enough for moving through many of the KU band applications. I think there are only one or two pending, if I'm not mistaken, two pending at this point. So there's no pattern that we have put in place to get these out in batches. As my staff is working through them and as they are cleared by the agency and through the IRAC process, we are queuing them up for the commission to consider. So I think what we saw today was an opportunity for a confluence of work products to come together in time for Space Month. And really kudos to my staff for working very hard to make that happen. We didn't hold anything back. We actually accelerated some of them to really get up here. So people worked long hours and hard to make sure that we did this. What the future holds and how we deal with these, I'm not sure, Monty.
Well, I've got a couple of questions about the Galileo order.
Okay.
Can I ask them here?
Galileo.
Yeah. So I was wondering what it means, I guess firstly what it means for Legado, and is it going to have any additional constraints on their operation in future, or does it change nothing in comparison to what they already have to do to not interfere with GPS?
So this decision doesn't have anything to do with the implications for Legato. Legato's requests for license modifications and matters for their ATC component of their satellite system are entirely separate from what just happened in the Galileo order.
Okay, so it has no consequence at all beyond. No. Okay. And if I can ask more questions, I was wondering. I mean, are there any plans to authorize the was it GLONASS, the Russian one, and the Chinese one? I think there's an Indian one coming online as well. I mean, do we have any plans to authorize those, or just the European one?
So if you take a look at the order, we detail why this is a very unique case. It starts with the 2004 coordination agreement between the United States of America and the European Commission, where the EC recognized that they wanted to develop a system that was frequency compatible with the GPS system. And that agreement served as the basis for ongoing negotiations and eventually the submission to the United States NTIA by the European Commission for the Galileo to be operational in the U.S. for the receive-only signals. The process from there was that NTIA made a recommendation to the Commission to put that out on public notice, which is what we did last year, and evaluated the comments and put it forward for consideration.
And that the same process hasn't happened for GLONASS or anything else. Okay. So is there any plan for enforcement if our phones, if on the mass market there were phones with GLONASS chips, for example, are there any plans to prevent those chips from being used?
So there's an interesting aspect here, and I'm going to let Julie Knapp come in if I go off track here, Julie. Today in your phones, you have different band settings that don't work in the U.S., but when you go to, let's say, Japan, they might work at that point. The fact that they're in the handset here in the U.S. does not mean that they're illegal or that the handsets are illegal. It's the actual transmission of the signals that would be causing a problem. What we did in this order is we've allowed certain frequency bands from Galileo, the E1 and the E5, to be received by GPS by position receivers here in the U.S. as well. So Julie, do you want to? Yeah. So there's no other indication if there's people who are having a handset here that can work with another country and it's not operating. Software also is an important part of this. Software defines how a lot of these bands get operationalized. So that's another key factor that needs to be considered.
Okay. I promise it's one final one.
We kind of have to move along, I think, at this point.
It's a very short one.
All right,
Okay,
Only
final
if it's
question.
on one of our other items.
It's about
all of our items loved.
It's about E6. The fact that that's not included in this, does that have any impact at all on the use of it for positioning? And was that part of the original 2004 agreement?
So the E6 was not included because there's considerations looking above 1,300 megahertz in the U.S. spectrum policy, and that would potentially, the grant of that would potentially conflict with what happens with that in the future. So that's why that was held. That was not granted. So no impact on their system, correct? Is that the, yeah. Right.
Thank you, Tom and Julie and your teams. Are there any questions on the media modernization item? Okay, hearing none. How about on hearing aid compatibility? Dave Kaut, okay. Could I have wireless come up on that one, please? Done? Dave? Go ahead.
Did you all make any changes to that transition? I heard the staffer referred to a reasonable transition period. Is it the same that you had in the draft?
I don't think we did, but you'll see it pretty quickly, I think, but I don't think there are any changes in that.
And can you just flesh out a bit? Commissioner O'Reilly mentioned that you broaden the scope of who can sign, I guess, the certifications. And then Commissioner Rosenworcel mentioned there were a couple things that she asked to be added about a date and about linking to some hearing aid compatibility. And I don't know what it was, some fact sheet or something. Can you tell us?
She was
Can you
talking
what?
about she was talking about a link to the FCC's webpage with information about hearing aid compatibility requirements.
Okay. And then on Mr. O'Reilly's thing, broaden the scope, what was that about?
I'm being pointed to the microphone. He was talking about what exactly goes into the certifications that have to be filed every year instead of the reports. I think as the commissioners described during the meeting, and we did, there's going to be a requirement that a knowledgeable official certify whether the company was in compliance with the hearing aid compatibility rules or not. Commissioner O'Reilly was talking about an alternative version of doing that, where instead of certifying whether they were actually in compliance or not, they would certify that they had procedures in place to help keep themselves in compliance.
That wasn't adopted.
His version was not adopted. Yeah.
Were there any other changes that weren't mentioned by the significance?
I think they should just go through the version once. I mean, we might have done a few clarifications, but
I don't think you'll see anything major that wasn't mentioned, though.
And who are you?
I'm Suzanne Tatro.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Anything further on this one? Okay, thank you, and the commissioners are here now. Thanks.
Any questions for us that we could help answer?
Yes, certainly. So I have a question for both of you. Since we're talking a lot about applications for satellite broadband, I was wondering if, as the commission approves more of these applications, whether you also expect the quality of satellite broadband to improve. I guess I'm mostly wondering whether there's a chance that the airwaves will become more cluttered with satellites, while satellite broadband might continue to be considered by some as an inferior option.
Look, I believe that the potential from the new applicants that were approved can potentially increase the quality of satellite service and offering broadband to consumers. But I also have been supportive of the current applicants in a number of different instances. Latency is one issue that people point out. There are a number of things that the providers have been doing on latency and trying to address those issues. So I think that there gets to the Commissioner Carr's point. I think consumers want service. They don't care that it comes from a terrestrial network or a satellite network or whatever. And we're trying to provide the best opportunity we can to make sure that every consumer is covered.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful and excited about where we're going potentially with this new generation of satellites. It is going to be an upgrade to a lot of the existing satellite services out there. The lower Earth orbit, as we've talked about, will mean lower latency, which can be important in certain applications. Higher speeds are being predicted for these satellites. I think we're going to continue to see more competition for broadband across technologies. I think that's why these decisions is a step in the right direction.
Hi, gentlemen. What needs to be done to bolster the resiliency of cell phone networks that everybody relies on, but that go out after hurricanes and big fires? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Chairman Pai recently stood up a new group that's going to be looking at some of these issues. I'm going to follow that very closely. After Hurricane Michael went through the panhandle of Florida about 2 weeks ago, I got to go down there and spend about 2 days with one of the telecom crews that are doing the restoration work and really see what it takes through their eyes. And it's really tough work. There's a lot of challenges. One issue that I talked about in a blog that I released after the trip was a lot of the fiber, in some cases, the communications towers survived the hurricane and survived being underneath the storm surges, but the recovery effort resulted in a lot of cuts. And in some respects, that's understandable. For instance, power companies need to very quickly move in and put up a lot of new poles because people need electricity. I think something in the order of 7,000 power crews came down to the panhandle to help with restoration. Some providers' networks who survived the storm were cut in the process of doing that. And so that's one question that I've teed up that I'm interested in. Is there more coordination we can do in that respect? Cuts during recovery and restoration are something that we see through every storm, but how can we do a better job of that in addition to those broader questions of making sure the network itself survives the storms?
I would agree with my colleague's point, but I may be a little stronger in the sense that these needless cuts, there are a number of stories and anecdotes that I got from the storm's surge, and it actually, it's something, it's close to home. My mom was in the center of that area, so I followed it incredibly closely and had not have to deal with the after effects. She's had to relocate. But the cuts, with the power companies just powering through, no pun intended, at will, they would, you'd have the communication companies sitting right there saying, please don't do this. We just got it reestablished, and they're going through anyway. And I get it. Power is very important. But communication for getting loved ones' information out is equally important, and we have to do a better job. It cannot be power first, no matter what. We've got to figure out that in a much better situation. Now, the second point, in terms of resiliency, there's only so much we can do in terms of, some storms are going to topple towers, and there's only so much we can plan for. And this is a storm that expanded as it got closer in time. And so there's only so much in terms of requirements that we can impose and the value of what we can ask for. If you saw the situation in Puerto Rico, it wasn't but the cement ones made out of cement that didn't go down. And so there's only so much we can plan for, and we're going to have remediation in any storm after the fact.
So would you say we'll need some kind of additional requirements or not from the FCC?
Well, I'm not sure they're going to be, it's going to have to be, in my opinion, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with power companies and the needless cuts that they make in terms of the rush to get service. I appreciate their desire to get service, but it can't be at all costs, in my opinion. So I don't know if it's going to be burdens that we're going to need to impose. We're going to have to figure out how to work with others.
Yeah, and then I'll add my focus is how do we solve this issue and make progress going forward through whatever means. And I'm hopeful that we can do it. And one reason is when I was with some of the crews down there, they told me that after a few days, the situation in that particular area, Mexico Beach, for instance, improved greatly. And it took a number of things. It took, from my understanding, some CEO-level phone calls to start to communicate. It took some threats of legal action, and it took some stern face-to-face discussions between telecom crews and power crews on the ground. And once those discussions took place, they saw a lot fewer issues going forward. So I think that tells us that this is an issue that can be addressed. And whether ultimately it's regulation or not regulation, I haven't made my mind up yet. I want to get more information. But these are things that can be addressed and we can improve going forward.
I'm sorry, I'll stop after this. But so the problem is mainly this interaction between the power restoration and the telephone network restoration. That's the locus of the problem in your all's point of view, not the native resiliency of the phone network itself?
When a storm or a hurricane comes through, or the wildfires in California, there's fiber in California right now that's been burned up, and that's from the fire. That's not from recovery efforts. So there are issues across the board where we can always do a better job with resiliency. What I'm saying is, from my experience down, this is one issue that people spotted that was unnecessary in the sense that it was post-storm that through better coordination was solved eventually. And so let's work on fixing and coordinating that. In this board that Pi has stood up is going to hopefully look at that, as well as, to your point, the broader issue of resiliency in the network generally.
Good, thank you.
Well, I would answer it and say, it is one of the biggest problems that came from this storm, and it's something I've been trying to figure out how to work with FERC and their authority to see if we can't build a partnership on that front. Because, we can't have power companies and telecom companies facing it off in the streets day after day and then say eventually it works out. That's not an acceptable resolution to the issue. Coordinating's fine, but having stern conversations, look, it's going to require more effort, and I'm trying to figure out if there's, a way to go through use the power of FERC, and I've got some friends that are in high levels over there, and maybe we can do something together.
Thank you.
I have a question for both of you about SpaceX. With their revised proposal to move some of their satellites closer, I'm wondering if you can comment on whether you feel comfortable granting a waiver so that they no longer need ITU approval on their proposal?
I'd have to think that through a little bit. The revised proposal, they were in to see me and talk about it. It was mostly on the issue of orbital debris. I spent a lot of time talking to them then, how some of the resolution would help on that front, and they were appreciative of what the commission was going along the lines, but I have to think it through a little bit further.
I would share Commissioner O'Reilly's view. We had a meeting where this was raised, but it was principally in the context of orbital debris and looking towards our orbital debris rulemaking, but happy to think more broadly about that issue.
We'll start here and we'll come back.
Hey, Margaret McGill with Politico. Senator Sullivan has raised concerns about the predictability and transparency of funding in the rural health care program. I'm wondering if either of you share those concerns or if you think the agency needs to change how it handles funding requests for that program.
I'm not particular on Senator Sullivan's concerns and haven't been involved in conversations. But I would say that I've raised multiple layers of problems with the management of our USF programs, and I think the USAC has a number of difficulties. And anyone that I've talked to in this space, any recipient, anyone who's applied, has had numerous problems, and there's no love loss. I've proposed a number of ideas, included full privatization of USAC to resolve that. We have, an issue between whose authority is it. USAC points to us, we point back to them. That's a problem in my opinion. So there are a number of layers of issues that administratively need to be addressed, and I'd like to see that happen.
I think across the board with all our universal service programs, predictability and sufficiency are critical, and perhaps no more so than when it comes to rural health care. I spent about a week in Alaska and had a chance to visit a lot of these rural healthcare clinics that are participating in this program, and it's a difficult situation. One clinic we visited in Manicodic, Alaska, it was 2 airplane rides and a long car trip along what passed for a road in that area. And so serving these communities, these remote clinics, is difficult, and we should be pushing to continue to provide predictability and sufficient support in this area. And that's why I was glad to vote to increase the cap, for instance, on the program a few months back by about 40–50%. And more generally, we have a broader rulemaking right now where people are commenting, and we'll take a look at all of the comments that we get to make sure we continue to support the program in healthcare through telehealth.
And just a quick follow-up on that. GCI has asked for a full commission review of its funding award from the Bureau. I think they got $78 million when they had asked for $105 million. I'm curious if either of you support the commission weighing in and potentially changing that decision.
Well, I think it's a good thing that we were able to move forward and free up roughly $70 million, 70% roughly of the funding, as you mentioned, and then there's a path forward for them to be able to make their case to all of us about potentially getting 100% or whatever the right number is. I'm aware that they have filed an application for review. I haven't looked at it, but I'm happy to take a look at the record and hear the arguments and ultimately cast a vote based on what the record shows.
I haven't a chance to digest their application. I hopefully will have a chance to talk to them and others on it. But again, it's been a number of years since I've been to Alaska, but I wrote a blog about this, and to me, what they're able to do and able to serve in that tough terrain is borderline magical. I've called it telecommunications triage. This is in some points, that clinic is the only thing that is serving for miles on end, and it is incredibly cost saving. It can be cost saving in terms of having to send the patient across the state or down to Seattle. So I was very impressed when I saw a number of things, and from my past history, I know Senator Stevens was involved in buying and helping to purchase the carts they use and the data that is used. So I've been supportive of the program, and I want to look at the data more specifically as we move forward.
Hi, this is Toby from Policy Tracker. You both approved authorization for Galileo in the US. Do you reckon it would be the Russian GLONASS system next, or the Chinese one, or the Indian one? Can you see yourselves supporting the approval of those GNSS systems in the US?
I think that's a hypothetical. I'll look forward to when someone puts in an application. I'll take a look.
Yes, sir. Happy to take a look at whatever request comes our way and make a decision based on the record at that point in time, but can't give a decision right now.
I'll add only that there have been a number of conversations on the Russian global positioning system, and Congress has been debating that issue for quite a while. So I wanted to hear any perspectives that they may have on the topic as well.
Commissioner O'Reilly, John Reed, Bloomberg Law. Do you have any updates on when the KidVid rules could be taken up?
I think I've said, the reply comments have just come in. I haven't digested either round yet. I will do that hopefully, later this year, barring my daughter not causing too much trouble. But it seems to me it's a Q1, Q2 project. I think I've said that publicly, and we'll just see, but I don't determine the timing of items. That is the chairman, and I have tried to be with everybody here very clear that he gets to decide, and I don't speculate. But it seems to be an early next year kind of thing, Q1, Q2 is my guess.
So I've heard some chatter recently about possible health concerns related to 5G, and I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit about how much you're allowed to address that or consider that as you regulate next generation technologies.
Yeah, we have experts here, whether it's in OET, in sister agencies, including the FDA, and they are constantly taking a look at the science and the studies in this space and making sure the rules that we have in place are adequate. And they continue, after looking at all these studies, to not have a change in their positions. I think I saw some news report in the last week or so from an FDA official that recently made some of these same points as well.
Hi, it's about the presidential memorandum on the national spectrum strategy. Do you think it goes far enough in terms of asking federal government to clear exclusive spectrum for mobile use or for commercial space use, for example?
I think I've said and put out a statement to the effect that I think it's beneficial, it's helpful, and I appreciate the administration's focus on the topic. I've also said yesterday I really appreciate the new legislation that was introduced by Senators Lee and Markey on the topic. I've been advocating for quite a while. I know Commissioner Rosenworcel's been advocating that we require the federal agencies to put a price on the spectrum that they're actually holding. It is the one, I can determine the one entity or one function that they have that they don't have a price. This commission is moving because we have a price on our per square footage per employee. We're going to go to a new location. Almost everything, we don't get free pencils, we don't get free anything, but somehow spectrum for federal agencies is determined to be free, and I think that's problematic. So the first step, in my opinion, is to have valuation. And I do appreciate the bill because it requires a market price be put on what are the holdings, and then we can make some decisions on whether that's appropriate. I do believe it will lead to spectrum efficiencies, and I think and I appreciate the legislation being introduced. I think that complements the good work the administration has done on its MOU and the work that the administration has led on this front, but I think it can always be more.
I put out a statement on. I think it's a really good step in the right direction, and it's part of a broader effort that you see across the administration and the independent agencies like us at the Commission. When you put
this important piece, the spectrum memo, together with everything that we're doing, we're moving in a really good direction when it comes to 5G and spectrum. We've already freed up more spectrum than any other country in the world. We've now moved forward with a pretty tight calendar of auctions, including one that's going on right now for spectrum. The State Department is pushing forward in international forums to push positions favorable to the U.S. when it comes to spectrum. So the memo is very important, and I think it's a great step, and particularly when you put it in the context of everything else that's going on. We're making a lot of really good progress on spectrum.
Commissioner Carr, Matt Daneman, Communications Daily. I guess I'm wondering, you specifically, talking about the debris NPRM, do you think the FCC should be in the debris mitigation business? Is this something that you personally think another agency would be better suited for?
Oh, I think we all, as agencies, and I think the presidential memorandum laid this out, have a role to play here. And that's why I was glad that the notice now asks even broader questions about exactly what should our role here be. I think as my statement laid out, there's some pretty technical, complex questions that are teed up, and I want to make sure that we have the right people at the right agencies answering those questions. Someone needs to get to the right answers here, but it can't just be anyone. And I think regardless, whether it's us in the lead or us standing right there in the lead, my point in the statement is let's make sure that we have the right people at the right agencies involved to make this decision. And I think that's what the item does, and so I'm happy to support it.
But you don't personally foresee or want a direction of, say, this being work being done by, say, commerce or transportation, something of that nature, which obviously would require congressional action, but I'm just curious from your sort of a philosophical standpoint.
Sure. I don't prejudge the outcome of this particular proceeding, and that's why I put those questions in there. I think as my statement makes clear, I do want to hear about expertise. I do want to hear about our authority. We have to solve these problems, these questions, these technical rocket science questions have to be answered. I mean, when you look at where we're going with this new generation of satellites being launched, thousands of more satellites closer together, we have to get orbital debris mitigation right. And my focus is making sure whether it's housed in the FCC or housed in Commerce or housed somewhere else, and we're all working together, that we get the right answer on this. And I think that's exactly what this rulemaking does. And I think even if you look back 3 weeks ago at the document that the chairman circulated, before my edits were put into it, it recognizes a lot of these same points, that we have really good experts across different agencies. We need to make sure that we're bringing all of that to bear to answer these questions. I would probably move on soon.
It's a final question from me. It's to Commissioner O'Reilly about the C-band alliance saying 200 megahertz is as much as we could do at 374.2. Is that enough spectrum for you? Previously, you'd asked them to try and release more, and now they say this is the limit.
Look, I think we're many rounds to go on the conversation on C-band. I've said 200, 300 is where I am. They think that they can get to 200. We'll just see how it plays out in the coming months. I appreciate all the good work that they've done, and I appreciate having a leadership team that's aggressively working on this issue. I think it's, I haven't endorsed the private sector model, but I think is a little, compared to the rest of the ideas that have been put out there, I find a lot of merit in that. I'm digesting the record from our NPRM, and we'll hopefully be able to resolve this, sometime next year when the chairman determines to pull the trigger.
Thanks.
One question. Do you see any, beyond just the challenge of ensuring that the safe operation of a rising number of satellites, do you see any technical challenges for satellite-based internet service providers to deploying high-speed internet in big numbers in the short term?
Well, look I think that there have been, if you talk to any of the satellite providers themselves, they'll say, we have a dozen applications, we have more than a dozen applications. They say, well, maybe only 2 or 3 are going to actually survive. It's going to be me and that guy. But they all have a different opinion of who else is going to survive. So that's the market doing its will. In terms of technicalities, it depends on who are those companies that survive and how big the constellations are and can they make them work. I've lived through some of the 90s and satellite expansion at that time. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. We held out our hopes that some would be more successful than they have been, and we'll just see where this goes. So, the huge constellations certainly cause an issue, in my opinion. It relates to orbital debris, and some of the models that they've put forward, they think they can make work, and we'll just see if that's the case, and they actually get operational, they actually get off the ground, and make something that consumers want. Seeing no more questions, John Donnelly, no, okay.
Todd.
Hi, Commissioner.
Hi.
Todd Shields, Bloomberg News. What should be done about failing cell phone networks that go down after hurricanes and fires? What steps should be taken, and do we need regulations?
At the FCC right now, I see a lot of talk and very little action. There are two things we need to do. The first is, after every natural disaster that affects communications, this agency should produce a report. And it's imperative that that report be timely. The report this agency produced after Hurricane Maria came out roughly 1 year after it made landfall. If it had come out in a more timely way, we could have taken some of those recommendations and put them to use in the Florida Panhandle. So first thing we need to do is produce timely reports to understand what went wrong, what went right, and what policies we need to change in the future. The second thing we need to do is take a fresh look at our wireless resiliency framework. The GAO has criticized this agency for its lax oversight of that framework. We should start a rulemaking to understand what elements of it need to be made enforceable.
Regulation down the road?
We should start a rulemaking and consider all options. The most important thing for us to do is make sure that our communications networks are strong, and I think a rulemaking would be the right place to start.
Thank you.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, Matt Danneman, Communications Daily. So what does a comprehensive orbital debris review look like? How is that different than what was passed today? Fill in those gaps.
All right. I laid out, first I'd like to just start and say, you should go back and you should prepare, you should take a look at what this agency had 3 weeks ago and what's going to emerge from our decision today. They're very different. We contemplated a big picture vision 3 weeks ago, but we had a whole host of changes made in the last 24 hours where suddenly my colleagues were concerned we have no authority to act in this area. That's certainly news to me. I don't believe that Congress has passed a new law. I do believe that this agency has authority over spectrum, commercial spectrum in particular, authorization of satellites and interference. We've worked on orbital debris as far back as 2004. And right now, at the very moment that we are shooting more things into the sky, we're going to step back and say, well, maybe we shouldn't be working on this? Something about that doesn't sound right to me. I'm curious who in the administration reached out to my colleagues to suggest that they needed to change the text of this item because it was changed substantially. Now, with respect to a broader vision and a broader program, I laid out 3 things in my statement. First, I said every satellite needs to be trackable. We need to know what's up in orbit with some precision. Second, they all need to be drivable. That's a key part of preventing collisions. And third, the principle, what comes up, what goes up must come down applies. We've got to make sure that there are plans for deorbiting what we put up in our high altitudes.
Hi, my name's Toby. I'm here with Policy Tracker. Yeah, you mentioned in your statement on Galileo about other GNSS systems,
Sure.
the Russian GLONASS, the Chinese one. Could you expand on what you mean by that? Do you think we should be authorizing them or enforcing it when they're already installed in devices that are
But to be
operational?
clear, we don't have anything before us. What I was speaking about in the statement was that we proceed to authorize the Galileo service here, but we ignore the fundamental fact that there are chips in many of our phones that can access foreign satellite systems and may be doing so today. And before the FCC goes any further, we need to understand where those chips are present, how they're operating, what signals they're receiving, and what security problems could result. I'm fearful that our framework for authorizing the use of foreign satellite systems like Galileo has been overrun by the way that technology has evolved and the way that our phones are mass-produced and built for worldwide use. Margaret.
Yeah, Margaret McGill with Politico. Just to follow up on the orbital debris question, what makes you think somebody in the administration reached out to suggest changes?
I'll be candid with you. I'm not certain about it, but I do get the sense that there's a renewed interest in space policy. You see that with the National Space Council. You see that with the introduction of a new military force. And then you see it in the realities of the growth in the space sector. We could be heading towards a sector of $1 trillion worth of economic value. So I think that the interest in these issues is growing across the board and across the government.
Okay, I have another question, not related to that, but it's about GCI and Senator Sullivan's concerns kind of more broadly about funding in the rural healthcare program. GCI has asked the commission to review a Bureau decision on funding. I'm curious for your thoughts on how the agency handled that funding request and if you think there needs to be changes.
So I don't have a lot of specific details, but I think that this program needs more predictability and sufficiency for those who participate in it. Rural health care depends on it, and this agency has work to do.
Hi. It's about the presidential memorandum on the spectrum strategy. Do you think it got the balance right in terms of asking for more spectrum to be shared or making it available for exclusive licenses? Because it didn't seem to be talking about spectrum clearances that much this time.
I think the most important thing to know about that new memorandum is we are slowing down. At a point when the world is racing to lead in 5G, we're headed to study hall. It'll be 270 days before we have a new national spectrum policy. That's a shame. Already, we're behind. South Korea's already auctioned the 28 gigahertz spectrum that we are so proud to be auctioning right now. But beyond millimeter wave, we've got mid-band spectrum, and Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, and South Korea have already put that spectrum to market. We are not in a leading position, and slowing down and spending another 270 days to get our spectrum strategies straight is not going to help us lead. I'm afraid it's going to make us fall further behind.
Hi, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Do you have a reaction to the Northeastern University study that claims to have found possible widespread throttling and possible violations of net neutrality principles from major providers?
I think it demonstrates that net neutrality matters and that companies, when they have the technical ability to censor and slow your traffic, the business incentive to do so, and the legal right, they will go ahead and make it happen. That's just what I said I feared when I voted against this agency's misguided rollback of net neutrality policies roughly a year ago. And now we're learning from academic researchers that it's already happening. And I don't see our colleagues over at the Federal Trade Commission taking action. I think that's a shame.
Hi, Commissioner Rosenworcel. Kelsey Gervis, Law 360. I recognize that this is a long shot, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
All right.
Do you have any updates or any thoughts about items before the commission or anything going on in these halls that might be perceived as holding up the nominations in Congress for the open seat?
No, that's above my pay grade.
Okay, thank you.
John Reed, Bloomberg Law. You said you want the FCC to approve, or I guess repurpose mid-band spectrum more quickly. Are there any proposals on the C-band that you're leaning toward right now?
I'm taking a look at what's before us, concerned about the viability of that proposal and the precedent it sets, but we're still taking a look.
Sorry, which proposal? The satellite
Are
companies?
you speaking about the C-band proposal? Yeah.
Okay.
All good. The tang outlasts the whole meeting.